Hey there, thanks for clicking on this link and watching this little video. If you don't know who I am, I'm lead pastor of Faith Reformed Church, Drew Poppleton. And in order to frame the context for why I've asked you to watch this video, why I'm even presenting this video, I actually want to go back to December 2019 and a presentation I made during the congregational meeting at that time. And during that congregational meeting, I talked about some things that were on the horizon. And one of them was this item in white that you see right there. What if we shift the church calendar? Shift the church calendar. So what was being presented at that time was that instead of having the church calendar revolve in many ways around December 31st, January 1st, the normal calendar year, what if instead the calendar revolved around the ministry year? And so what we were talking about was instead of having the things that normally turn over January 1st, have that happen July 1st. And here's what we mean by that. We wanted it to reflect the ministry year, which tends to reflect the school year, tends to experience a big lull actually in the summertime, not right at the heat of December 31st and January 1st. That's usually when we're most busy, right around that time. So what if the church calendar reflected the ministry year instead? So part of what that means is, what if we had a fiscal year that ran around July 1st instead? And what if we had a serving period for elders and deacons that revolved around July 1st? And what if, instead of having a congregational meeting that happened right around Thanksgiving of every year and was a pretty busy time for people, what if instead we kind of had two congregational meetings? One at the end of the ministry year, usually in early June, that was like a ministry celebration of all the things that had happened in ministry for that year. And then one that was in September, early September, that was like a fall kickoff that kicked off the ministry for the year and got people involved in ministry and told people what was happening for the coming year and all that good stuff. Well, we approved that plan. Part of what that meant was that we have changed the fiscal year to July 1st. The elders and deacons will revolve next July 1st. All the current ones have decided to stay on for 6 months more than they were originally supposed to stay on. So they're all going to serve 3.5-year terms instead of 3-year terms. We did have a ministry celebration in June. It wasn't in early June as we had originally proposed, but it was in late June, and we celebrated the ministry year, and we celebrated the ministry of Scott Bills, and we published a newsletter called Life at Faith that celebrated all sorts of ministry that had happened. And now we're heading into the fall, and instead of having a ministry kickoff, we're having a family fun day this Sunday at Jacob's Farm. And instead of there being a way to present all sorts of ministry stuff that has happened and is happening, I'm coming to you with this virtual presentation. So I'm coming to you virtually. So I hope you watch this whole thing. The beauty of it being virtual is that you can fast forward if you want. Or you can also change the speed. If you just look at the settings, you can change the speed. You can listen to me at 1.5 times or 2 times the way I'm normally talking. But I will be talking for a little while. I hope you'll stay engaged. If Faith is your church and you want to know what's happening, this is a great way to know what's happening. So I hope you stay engaged for as long as I end up speaking. Everybody who listened last December at the congregational meeting, which was also long, seemed to appreciate it. So I hope you appreciate this too. And if it raises any questions for you, naturally there's no immediate feedback, but you can follow up with me in one of 2 ways. First of all, there's going to be a virtual town hall meeting this Sunday at 10:30. The live stream happens at 9, and immediately after that, you can come on at 10:30 on Zoom. There will be a link in your email, and we can talk about the sermon for this upcoming Sunday, and we can talk about anything from this presentation. Also, will be available for interaction at Jacob's Farm that afternoon. So let's get into it, and I want to talk about, what has happened in ministry, what is going to be happening in ministry at Faith Reformed Church. And I think the first thing to be said about that is that the overshadowing theme of what has been happening and will be happening is this: COVID. It has severely disrupted a lot of things. It's also presented a lot of opportunities for things. And so I'll talk about both of those things, the disruptions and some of the opportunities that are coming out of that. And it'll sort of It's kind of overshadowing all the things that have been happening, but it'll sort of be undergirding or underneath all the stuff that I'm about to talk about relative to ministry. And if you haven't figured it out yet, this is much less polished than a normal sermon that I might give. There's no kind of manuscript. I just have some notes, and I'm going to go. So, last December, I had framed my experience. I wanted to share my experience as a pastor in a pastor's report, and I framed it using these three categories: responsibilities, relationships, and context. Namely, that I was trying to live into various responsibilities and figure out what all my responsibilities were. That I was trying to build as many relationships as possible, just trying to get to know people in whatever ways possible. And that I was trying to get to know the context. And that is that all ministry takes place within a context, not only the context of a particular church, but in a particular community, and trying to just learn all that stuff about the church and about the community. And COVID has done a good job of disrupting all three of these. That my responsibilities have morphed a little bit. Some of the responsibilities are very much the same. Some of them have morphed. The relationship building came screeching to a halt because of COVID and has just slowly started to build up again. And then the learning about the context has changed completely because the context itself has changed, right? The way in which we are a community has changed, not only as a church, but as a community called Traverse City or Grand Traverse area. And that context continues to evolve as we go. So I'm still interested in all three of these things. And I'm interested in what it looks like moving forward on all three of them. So I hope we can continue to build relationships with one another. I hope that we can continue to learn together about the context, because we're going to all have to learn now, not just me, because everything has changed, and continue to live into various responsibilities that need to happen around here. So that kind of helps frame what I want to say here. And based on my observations, my building of relationships and my observations of the context last fall, I had also framed my experience by giving these preliminary observations. And all the items in the left column are what I saw as kind of strengths or assets of what's going on. And then what I saw, the observations that appear in the right column are kind of, I don't want to call them liabilities, but they were kind of question marks for me, things I was wondering about. So strengths that I saw, just the vast amount of experiences that people have around here and the ways in which they're involved in mission and outreach and ministry and seeing their own workplace as a ministry, and just amazing stuff. And I was also just so impressed, continue to be impressed by the hunger that people at Faith Reformed Church have to grow in their faith, to deepen their faith, to take that next step in spiritual maturity. And that has continued to take place, and I've continued to see other people around the community that are hungry, very hungry. And I think COVID, on one hand, seems to have kept people away from church, and yet at the same time has stoked a spiritual hunger. People are looking for answers, looking for meaning more than they ever have. And part of what I had noticed was also that there's a strong core that's here, and it's just fantastic. There's lots of generational stuff that's happening, and even more that could be happening, because I've noticed so much that there's this whole group of people in their 30s and 40s, and there's this whole group of people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and they don't really know each other. I'm so interested to see, as we emerge from a COVID world, how we can get different groups to interact with each other. And because you would be so blessed. I've gotten to know people in all these different generations, and you would be so blessed to intermingle in those generations. So those are some of the observations I made and have continued to make. And then, of course, I made these observations that are in the right-hand column, like there seems to be some places where maybe we're not as reformed as I would have thought we'd be, considering that we're Faith Reformed Church. We're part of the Reformed tradition. There's some ministry that seems to be taking place in silos and not necessarily communicating with one another. There seems to be some hangovers from years gone by of the fact that a lot of things being staff-driven instead of lay-driven. And maybe staff were set up for a past that no longer exists. And there was all sorts of staff transitions happening at that time. And now they have happened, and there's still other staff transitions left to be had. So those were all things that I was observing, continue to observe. And based out of those observations, I saw that there were some little things on the horizon. I already highlighted the third item on this list, but I want to go back to this list because I want to give you some updates on some things that have happened relative to this list. So there were some little things on the horizon, right? One, should we have some new bylaws? The bylaws were from 2002 when the church was in a different state than it is now. So one of the things that we did in January as a consistory, or February as a consistory, was approved a new set of bylaws going back to just a basic, a simple structure that's advocated by our denomination. And it's really simple. If you ever want to see a copy of the bylaws, you can. But it's just going back to a simpler version. And I like it because it also gets us a little closer from a polity, church governance side of things, back to just elders and deacons and a consistory-led kind of organization. And I think that's really important, and I think the consistory has stepped up big time in ways that are visible and invisible during this time, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But yes, we do have new bylaws. Second, it felt like we needed the personnel team to be renewed because all those staff transitions were taking place, and staff transitions have continued to take place, and it's important to have a personnel team. And so that personnel team has been formed. It includes the executive team, which are 2 elders and 2 deacons, Dave Anderson, Mark Byland, Brenda DeKuyper, Eric Breitup, and 2 at-large members, Brad Weirda and Pam Simons. So those 6 people make up the personnel team, and they've been busy in different ways. First of all, there's been a youth task force that's been led by Mark Byland that's looking for a new youth pastor, and we've talked to one candidate, and that candidate didn't work out. We've got apparently 2 other candidates now that are on our radar screen, and we'll see if one of those works out. In the meantime, Mark and the youth task force, which includes myself, and some of the current youth leaders have worked out sort of a plan for the fall. And so if parents have been updated about that, but yes, there is a parent meeting at Jacobs Farm, 5 p.m. this coming Sunday. So if you're out there, hopefully you can attend. But that's being led by a personnel team and people that are a part of that. We've also started the children's ministry coordinator position search. We had a great exit interview with Scott. We're working on refining some of the job descriptions for those of us who are on staff and the way in which we will be reviewed, and a review of myself since I've been here for a year. So that team is busy, that personnel team. I just wanted to give you that update. Of course, the shifting church calendar, I've already talked about that. And we still need to live fully into it, but it's happening, and it has been approved, and it is happening what it means to live into it. I also presented that maybe we needed to do a hospitality audit, and what I meant by that was just go around with a whole group of people and just see in what ways are we hospitable to the people who would be visiting us as guests, and what would that look like? And we didn't do that yet, this hospitality audit. I think it would be a great exercise. But partly it didn't happen because COVID happened. And so we've had to think about all sorts of things related to COVID and some hospitality things related to that. And I have 2 things to say about it. One is that in the process of thinking about COVID and thinking about hospitality, we are rethinking what it means to do welcome. So first thing about that. I forgot that these things won't come up one at a time. I thought they were going to come up one at a time on that slide, but not the way it works in here. Okay, anyway, they're both there. First of all, revisiting welcome. We've had to rethink what that looks like when we go indoors here, starting September 20th. And we've been rethinking, how do we get the ushers and greeters all part of one team that's thinking about a whole welcome experience in which those of us who are part of the faith community show up here on a Sunday morning and just feel like we're coming back home. You know, it feels like that kind of place, that we're coming back to this place where we inherently sort of belong, and we're going to have yet again another experience of encountering God. And for those people who are not part of the faith community, they're showing up as guests, whether they're friends and family or whether they're truly searching for a new church community or they've never met Christ at all, that we want the kind of experience for them that from the moment they pull in the parking lot and get out of their car and find their way and come up into this space, that they will feel like they've come to the home that they didn't know that they didn't know, that they didn't know that they didn't have. And that they'd be welcomed into a community where they might end up belonging. Now, not everybody will belong here. We have a certain personality, and some people might belong better at another church, and they'll have better and grow better in their faith at another place. That's okay. But we want it to be that kind of place where we're welcoming and entertaining strangers unaware. That's why I labeled this entertaining strangers. That's from that Hebrews passage. We want to entertain strangers in such a way that they might be angels all the same. And then second of all, another thing we've been thinking about relative to this hospitality audit is there's been all sorts of people thinking about what would it look like to take on a new campus plan. There have been various plans over the years, none of which have sort of come to fruition, so over the past 15, 20 years about what could be different about this campus. I don't believe we have the momentum right now to enact a massive campus plan, but can we work toward that? I think we can. And I hope that collectively we'll continue to think bigger and bigger about what could actually take place around this campus, because it doesn't just need a refresh, it might need sort of a renovation altogether. But at the very least, it needs a refresh. Lots of people talking about that. And interestingly, lots of people asking about our facilities. We've had 3 or 4 groups approach us about what could happen in that old HelpLink building that's over at the intersection over there and what could take place. So what would it look like, if this location could be the awesome hub that it is? We're right in the center of so much. We need to renew this campus and be thinking about that. And that's part of what's coming up. And that's part of what's already happening, is rethinking that. Next, coming back to these little things on the horizon, one of the things on there was this guiding principles of worship. Guiding principles of worship. So I was back then making that observation in December 2019 of, do we have guiding principles that guide our worship? Because I just sort of walked into an environment where there was a couple things that happened, but did we have a bigger theological picture about what God would want for our worship? And so I want to talk about a few things that have happened relative to worship. First of all, creativity. Every time we have a new sermon series, we try to get together a creative group to think about some of the ways in which we can bring those elements to life. And so I think that's produced some great fruit, one of which was in January. We had the fig leaf thing where we came forward and we surrendered some of the fig leaves that we like to wear and put them back on the tree. And we had this miraculous exchange, is what they call it, with not only giving God what we didn't need anymore, but then getting from God table. And so we had that great communion experience. And speaking of good communion experiences, it was out of that creative planning process that on March 8th we had the giant feast up front, and we not only came to enjoy communion, but we came together in groups as a foretaste of this feast that is to come. Those sorts of things are all coming out of creative planning. Also, like when we did the Psalms series, we had all those Psalms devotionals that we were putting out during the week, and so all sorts of things like that coming out of creative planning, and I think that's been really good, really well received. Lots of people with an openness to those kinds of experiences. We just had a creative planning heading into our new upcoming sermon series, so I think there's some good stuff that's going to happen around that. So that's been fun. We also talked about communion, and we were going to have a sermon series around communion that featured communion, not only sermons that were about communion, but then having communion every week for 11 weeks straight. That was what was going to happen from April 19th to June 28th, and then COVID happened. So that's why I put a question mark behind it in the slide, was just that, are we going to come back to that? Yeah, we're going to come back to that. And the number of people who have expressed a great openness toward weekly communion is a lot of people. And for those people that have misgivings about it, that it might become more rote, it might be special about it, I just hope continue to have an openness to it, because I think maybe I'll introduce some things to you about communion that you just don't know that you don't know, and that as I introduce those things to you, the whole experience will become so rich, and you'll see why it's so important that we have it every single week, because it's such a, for a whole multitude of reasons, including the fact that it itself is such an embodiment and an experience of the gospel, and that's part of what we need to be reminded of every week. So we'll come back to that. That gets at that next item that's on this slide, a theology of worship, meaning what does it look like to really articulate and discern a theology of worship, meaning thinking about what does God really want for us when we gather in our worship settings on a Sunday morning? What does God really want out of that? What do we, and oftentimes I think that some people have not taken the time to sort of get up to that 30,000 foot view and take that perspective on worship, but instead have sort of gone with the flow, or got caught up in debates about contemporary versus traditional, or new music versus old music, and whether we should have, communion once a month or weekly communion, and just the basic practical nuts and bolts conversations, instead of looking big picture at what God wants. And so I've initiated some conversations about a theology of worship, not only with Stephanie, but also with the elders who are officially in charge of worship, and with a few other people. And I want to expand that conversation, and that's actually going to bleed right into the upcoming series. The upcoming series that we've got for the fall, all the way building up to Advent, so basically September, October, November, is about these encounters with God that people have in the Scriptures that then give us indications on the way in which our worship services should be structured. Because there's this common pattern that takes place, and we learn through those biblical examples a lot of the way in which we should interact with God when we come together on a Sunday morning, and the way in which we should interact with one another. So I'm excited about that sermon series. I'm excited to sort of show some people, show many of you out there what maybe you've never been taught before, and maybe that you didn't know, or maybe that you've experienced but you just didn't have language to put around it. And as we go through that series, we're going to be actually enacting in worship some of the things that we're being taught about worship. And in the process, be articulating a theology of worship. And all through that whole thing, I hope that you'll be deeply connected. If you're not coming to worship on Sunday mornings, I hope you'll be connected through the live stream. And we've done so much work with the tech team. Like, praise the Lord, what a COVID opportunity it has been to actually rethink everything technological. And the tech team had a great tech training about 2 weeks ago. And I think we're ready to go to deliver the live stream in a really excellent way when we are back in person. And so that'll be really good. And along with that sermon series, there's going to be a curriculum that Drew Peterson and I will put out that is based on this book called You Are What You Love. So the curriculum itself will be 4 sessions. It'll be in each one of those sessions, there will be a chapter from this book to read, a follow-up video that kind of reinforces some of that stuff, and you do all that on your own, reading the chapter and watching the video, and then some discussion questions. And the discussion questions can be for any group of people. It can be for just you and the people in your household, or it could be for a small group to go through, or it could be just you and a best friend, or a couple of friends. But we're hoping that you'll be able to engage it. If your small group already has curriculum chosen for this fall, if you've already signed up for enough, you don't have to. But we're going to put out this curriculum that goes hand in hand with the upcoming series. And the reason it goes hand in hand is that James K. Smith here, who wrote this book, You Are What You Love, really makes a powerful theological argument for the role of worship in cultivating our loves, cultivating our deepest desires, and that part of what's happening in worship isn't that we're just like trying to come in and cultivate those ourselves and build up enough love and expression of love to God, but that God is actually working on us to cultivate what it is that we love. And God is working on us to recalibrate us toward his kingdom. And so we're going to get into that, and I hope you get into it. There's a reason right at the top there, if you can see it, if the image isn't too small, there's a reason that this book has sold over 100,000 copies. And in the small little Christian world, 100,000 copies is a lot. And the reason it sold so many is because he makes such a compelling case for who we are as human beings and the way in which worship plays a role in that. So we're going to look at the first 4 chapters of that book. We're going to have a curriculum around it, like I said, that's going to involve some videos that reinforce the concepts and help explain them, and some discussion questions. So yeah, as a small group, or maybe with a good friend of yours or whoever, I hope that you'll engage this. So I want to come back to some of those other things that I was talking about, including one of my preliminary observations was whether how reformed are we? And so previously I talked about how we changed the bylaws to reflect a little bit more of getting back to consistory-led, elder and deacon-led kind of governmental structure that we're working on. I think that's a very reformed thing. I think it's also a very reformed thing, some of the worship things that I was just talking about, because we're going to reinforce what has been traditional, reformed worship over the years, and we're going to reinforce some of those ideas, including that John Calvin was one of the guys who articulated, yes, we should have weekly communion. John Calvin was super passionate about that, among other things related to worship. Yes, and I just want to say that there has been other progress related to what it means to step into what it means to be reformed, because, as you may or may not have seen, the elders and deacons have really stepped into their roles more. The deacons, they're asking bigger and bigger questions about what does it really mean for us to be deacons, and how can we be involved in service? How can we promote ministry? How can we make sure we're financially good stewards? They're just really stepping into their role and figuring out their identity, and they're just so curious about how to do it better and better, and what we mean by that is how to do it in a more faithful way. And then there's the elders. In reality, to be reformed is to be an elder-driven church. That's the governmental structure we've got. We're not run by bishops that are far off. We're not run by a congregation that is a democratic model. We think that elders have a theological wisdom that they're supposed to bring to the table. And man, the elders have really been stepping it up as I've tried to put a ton of responsibilities in their hands. So they each have an elder care list. So they're in charge of 1/6 of the congregation, and they've been reaching out to those people who are members in that way. And they're serving on the executive team. They've been involved in all of the decisions in the whole consistory and all the COVID-related decisions, and more and more, including elders being a part of conversations about worship, about discipleship, about different things. So I'm really pleased with the way the consistory has stepped up. They've been really active, like I said, in ways that are visible and invisible. Another thing I want to talk about from this list is ministry silos. One of the things that I talked about was that sometimes ministries were taking place in these various silos. That was one of the things that the staff had related to me, that there wasn't always good collaboration. So we're trying to work as a staff to increase communication between one another and what's happening, and how can we collaborate together in ministry and help one another out. So that's happening on a staff level. And I want to see it happen even more on a ministry team level. So we have all these ministry teams out there. We've got a music team that helps make the music on Sunday mornings. We have a tech team. We have a children's team, a youth leaders. We've got a security team, greeter team, usher team, missions team, prayer team. And often these different teams are doing great ministry that isn't often known by everybody else that isn't necessarily on that team. And so as I looked at that and wondered, I looked at all sorts of things and observed all sorts of things relative to ministry teams. One of them was that there wasn't always communication taking place between teams. It wasn't always obvious to some of those teams how they communicate with the staff and with the larger congregation. So the security team would have something that's for all of us to know, but wouldn't know exactly how to get it to all of us. And then there'd be a security team doing things that the greeting team should know about, but they don't know how to communicate with one another. Some of that stuff. And then in the process of observing it, really realizing that different members of each team had different expectations of what it meant to be on those teams. Also realized that there were any number of teams that have been led by the same person for a long time. And what if that person dies, like tomorrow? Does the next person know what to do? And do we know what kind of person to look for to lead that team? You know, if Jay Youngflesh, heaven forbid, or heaven take him, anytime soon, then what would it look like to replace him? So asking a lot of those questions. All that said, a really major thing that I want to report to you is that we have enacted a ministry team policy. So just this past August meeting of consistory, they approved this ministry team concept. And here's the bulk of what it's about, that every ministry team would generate these 3 documents that would be guiding documents for that team. One being a team charter that says, here's what our team's about. Here's our purpose, how that fits into the larger purpose of the church, how we set about trying to go about that purpose, the different activities that we're involved in. So this has multiple benefits if you create a team charter. First of all, as a team, if you take the time as a team to generate this document together, you can all contribute to and agree upon what is our central purpose and how are we going about doing what we do in order to accomplish that purpose. And anybody who's not on that team can all of a sudden then know, here's what that team is about. So that's another one of our ministry team problems, is that there's a missions team out there, but it's not always obvious, how do you get on that missions team? And what would happen if I was on that team? Well, if you have a team charter, then we can publish those things, put them up on the website, highlight them on a ministry kickoff kind of Sunday, highlight them at different times and say, this is what it means to be on the mission team. Or are you passionate about these things? Why don't you come join us? You know, so it's all caught up in that team charter. There would also be a team leader job description, which says, here's what I'm doing as a leader of this team. So for any one of the teams that I mentioned, now we know what it means to pass that leadership on to another person if that which would happen to happen. And in the midst of that team leader job description and the team charter, it says who's the staff person that acts as a liaison, or sometimes the staff person is in charge of that team. But either way, we want to connect them to a staff person, because part of the staff person's job is to serve that ministry and help that ministry thrive, and by helping it communicate, helping it accomplish what it needs to accomplish, helping all sorts of things. So that's another thing. And then also, finally, this team member expectations document. So like I said, sometimes with any given team, there's different expectations of what it means to be a member of that team, and such a good activity to sit down every single year, and hopefully in summer times, as a ministry team and reestablish what are the expectations we have for each other. Everything from just the minor, simple stuff of what time do you show up to fulfill this role, to how will we communicate with each other? What will we communicate with each other? What does it mean to serve on this team? What kind of people do we hope to be, and how do we want to be together? All those sorts of expectations. And so we have a lot of faith that if we can create these documents and then revisit them every summer as ministry teams, that it will help everybody involved in the whole church, not only with communication, but recruitment of team members, really clear expectations, how we pass on leadership in those various teams, which staff members are in charge of which kind of thing, all that stuff. So the consistory approved that, and I'm excited to see what happens with that. So, yes. That was another one of those items that was on the preliminary observations, all tied to these little things that are on the horizon. And I also, during that time, mentioned back last December some big things that were on the horizon. And I want to highlight some of those for you now and come back to those, because I've given you an update on lots of things and where we're headed with lots of things. But now I want to come back to this big things on the horizon. And this is the way I presented it back in December 2019 in this order. I'm going to do it in a slightly different order this time around, but I want to cover all these things. So first thing I want to cover is just relationships and context. That relationships and context were these things that I was working on when I first got here, and I wanted to continue working on them in December of 2019, and I think they're continue to be important as we move forward. Building relationships, not only myself, but all the staff, all the leadership, all of us, and we got to come back together because we've been separated by this COVID thing, and we got to build relationships yet again. So there's just a lot of relationship building that has to go on. And like I said before, it's not just not just me, that has to learn about the context, because the context has changed for everybody now. So all of us will have to keep learning and keep fresh with all that stuff. So another thing that I had highlighted back then was this Vision 2020 thing that was happening in our denomination. Because of COVID, our General Synod 2020 got canceled, and everything's been postponed to 2021. And there's a lot of things moving and shaking in our denomination. I don't want to talk a lot about that right now because I could bog down this. This is already long enough, and I could bog it down more. There will be further communication about that in the future. So there will be communication about what's happening in our denomination. And one of the big things that's happening in our denomination is a conversation around sexuality. And so one of the things that we're going to do in 2021 as a church is to look at human sexuality. And that will be one of the sermon series and one of the things that we study. And I think much like I was talking about worship before, I think the same thing with sexuality. I think we just sort of go along and never take enough time to get to that 20,000, 30,000 foot view and look down and really take a good theological look for ourselves at everything that God has to say about sexuality, about marriage and singleness, about pornography and promiscuity and cohabitation and homosexuality and all these different issues around human sexuality. And I think it'll be really helpful for all sorts of people, and myself included, to get up to that 20, 30,000 foot view and have this big sort of big theological view. Take a look from God's perspective. Stop thinking about the 20, 30,000. Take a look from God's perspective. Take a good look at what the Bible has to say about those various issues that I was just naming, and the way in which we live into them. And I think it'll be eye-opening, educational, perspective-changing, perspective reinforcing too, and all sorts of things. And so I'll be with a lot of fear and trepidation, and yet with a lot of confidence and fun. I'll look forward to being a guide for you in that process, along with other staff and elders and different leaders around the church. It should be good. It should be good. I hope that everybody stays engaged and enjoy and gets in the conversation and gets to see all that God has to say about all those things. So, yes, and then another thing that I had looked at back then was not just this Vision 2020, but also that another big thing on the horizon at that time was the contentious election. And here we are, 9 months later, and sure enough, it is contentious out there. And I don't have a ton to say about that right now either. I might have a few things to say between now and Election Day, planned out what the Sundays are going to look like before and after Election Day, and I hope we've got good godly guidance on that, guidance from God. And so I'll have more to say about it, but just I guess what I'd say in the short term is for all of us to continue to think about not only, what we believe about certain political positions, but who we want to be in the midst of it. Who we want to be in the midst of it. Because it's, the biggest plague I see is when we're, A, not approaching it with a whole ton of humility, and B, approaching it with a ton of judgmentalism towards people who don't believe like we do. And this whole election is such good practice for living into what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And I guess I'll say more about that later, but that's all I'll say for now. So yeah, a contentious election. And then the other thing, next item on the list, inviting and integrating. I was saying back then that one of the things that I wanted us to be concerned with was making sure that we're inviting our friends and family members and other people and coworkers to become a part of this community and to grow in their faith, whether that be the initial growth of their faith because they're disconnected, or later on because they've fallen away from the church, or whatever it happens to be, that we need to invite people and integrate them. A lot of that got put on hold because COVID put our in-person worship gatherings and other gatherings on hold. Well, as we start to gather again, and even as we begin to build our web presence. So I didn't mention it, but back on that previous slide, one of the things that it said about welcome was that the front door is no longer the front door, and you probably, I didn't explain it, probably wondering what I meant by that. What I mean by that is that outside our front door is no longer our front door. The front door is not only people that you encounter in your workplace, in your neighborhood, and whatever else. So it's people, and it's also our web presence. That if people want to know, if they want to find a church in the area, the first thing they're looking at is on the web. And we want to be mindful of that. And so we formed this media marketing team that is helping us rethink our web presence, and in the process, helping us redo our website. So in this coming months in the fall, you're going to see there's going to be a new Faith Reformed website. And that new Faith Reformed website won't just have like a new look, it'll have different features, and we just hope that you'll invite people to partake of what's there so that they can grow in their faith, and then invite them into conversations and invite them into this place and space. And the first place to invite them might be this upcoming Sunday, Jacob's Farm. You're welcome to bring guests, bring them, and have some fun together. So let's invite. And then the next item on this list was about discipleship and formation. That, one of the things that I'm passionate about is that people would grow in their faith. And so glad to have along with me on that journey fellow staff member Drew Peterson, who's part of his primary job description is to be a person who facilitates discipleship and formation around here and makes some things happen. And we've had some great conversations lately. And I want to talk to you about a few things that are happening relative to discipleship and formation. So I've talked about worship. I've talked about ministry teams. Those are two big things that are happening. Rethinking some of the ways we do worship and all the theology of worship, theology of weekly communion, theology of all sorts of stuff. Thinking about ministry teams and all the little vision that I put into that, and we'll say more about ministry teams. And want to think about discipleship and formation and continuing to help people to grow. And one of the things that's helping Drew and I think about this is a book out there called The Critical Journey. And in that book, they lay out that there are basically these 7 stages that every person who follows Jesus needs to go through on their journey of faith. Really helpful framework for thinking about discipleship and formation, because if we happen to be a person who's on this journey, sometimes we don't know what the next step is. Well, this lays it out. And sometimes as a church, we can emphasize certain ministries, but we need to emphasize a whole variety of ministries that help people. If you're at stage 1, get to stage 2. If you're at stage 2, to go to stage 3. If you're at stage 3, to go to stage 4. And then, this is interesting too, at the end of stage 4, what you run into is what they call the wall. And that requires a whole different sort of way of being and help to get through the wall instead of bouncing off the wall and rejecting the faith, instead of bouncing off the wall and becoming cynical about the faith, instead of being defeated by the wall and regressing in your faith and going back to stage 2 and all this stuff. So this is probably not helpful because it's not enough details for you to really discern what I'm talking about with these various stages. But you know what it's like to be on a journey, and that there's different stages on that journey and they require different elements. All of that is helping Drew and I, and we help people think through. We want to help you make the next take the next step in your journey. And people who are not yet on the journey, we want to help them get on the journey. So a lot of that is guiding our thinking. You're going to hear more about it in the future. So don't worry if you didn't follow what I'm talking about. Along with this, one of the things that helps people, especially through this thing called the wall that I was just talking about, is a ministry called Faithful. That's been an important component of what help form people in their faith. This past spring, we had an offering of the initial 101 retreat and a 24-week follow-up process that's called 201. We had 8 people start that, 7 people finish that, and nothing against the person who didn't finish it. They had some big stuff come up in their life they had to take care of. And we just had the last meeting of that the other day, and the testimonies from the people that went through it were amazing about what God is up to in their lives and the kind of transformation they still want to see taking place in their lives. So we're going to offer another offering of that in January. There's going to be an offering of that, so watch out for a 101 retreat offered in January, which will be followed up by 201. And this time around, we're going to ask that if you follow up for 101, if you sign up for 101, that you're committed to 201, because 201 is more important than 101. So that's going to be coming up. In the fall, we're doing something called a coach's training, where we're going to train people to listen deeply to other people and ask good questions, because we find that as you grow a more mature part of your faith, you don't need to know more. You need to have the capacity to actually act on what you know. And one of the ways that helps us do that really well is having a coach that comes along beside us. So a big part of faith walking is that you go through the 201 process with a coach who's listening deeply and asking good questions. So with this coach's training, we're going to help train other people to become coaches for faith walking, but it is not just for faith walking, this coach's training. If you are a small group leader, or if you just want to become better at asking good questions and listening deeply to other people, this is the class for you. If you're a spiritual leader in any way, this is a good class for you. It's coaches training for discipleship, because there's coaching out there for lots of stuff, life coaching and health coaching and all this stuff. This is coaching for discipleship, what it means to come alongside somebody, listen deeply, ask good questions so that they grow in their faith. You provide life-giving accountability. That's all I'm going to say about that. There is a page on our website about it. It's coming up real soon, so if you want to sign up for it, you got to check it out. Last thing I want to say about discipleship and formation is that I stressed last fall a thing called transformational learning. We had a really important Sunday school class or learning hour class about that, really important sermon series about it, and I don't want it to just be a passing thing. It has to become part and parcel, part of the DNA of the church, that people are engaged in transformational learning. And so hopefully this image is big enough for you, but this is what transformational learning is about. So much of traditional learning is just about the lower left-hand quadrant of that. Get people information, the information will do what it needs to do. That's how people learn. That is not how discipleship works. That is not how life in the faith works. That is not how you will ever be transformed. Instead, the information that we get, which whether we're reading our Bible or hearing from a pastor, preach a sermon, or whatever it is, that however we're getting information, has to be enacted. It has to be acted upon. We have to go and practice what we've learned. That is fundamental to discipleship and the life of faith, is that we have to practice it. And then we will learn what we haven't yet learned. Because you might think, you might learn some information from Jesus about, in Matthew chapter 7, that you shouldn't judge. But until you go out there and live your life and are constantly tempted to judge other people, whether with their political beliefs or the way they drive their car or whatever it happens to be, then you really haven't lived into what it means to not judge. And you have to figure out the particularities of when do I need to judge, because you can't be an ethical, moral person without judging. You have to judge between two options. Should I have an abortion or should I not? Well, you have to judge. But where does that fit in, that kind of judging, with what it means to judge somebody who, wears jeans to church? That's a completely different kind of judging. But you don't know anything about that until you practice it, and then you come back with a group of people and deeply reflect on what am I actually learning, and then get more information about what does God say about judging, and then go out there and practice again. And it is only through that process of information, then practice and reflection, and practice and continue reflecting and get more information and experience more of something. And it's only through that process that we actually grow. Just getting information will amount to nothing. Nothing. You will just, you just turn into a bloated Christian instead of an actual real Christian who embodies the fruits of the spirits and lives the way Jesus would have us live. So I cannot stress this enough, and I cannot tell you that as long as I am the pastor here, sorry, I'm getting fired up. As long as I'm the pastor here, we're going to continue to come back to it. So let me smile, say it in a nice way, and make sure that we're all on the same page. We're not all on the same page, but make sure that you're not hearing me as judging you right now or anything like that. I'm not mad. I'm not angry. I just want to promote this kind of learning. This is true learning in the kingdom. Not just the gathering of information, but the enacting, the practicing of the faith. And then it has to be done in a reflective way. Self-reflection and then reflection with other people. Listening to us, asking good questions, giving us good input, holding us accountable with life-giving accountability. Lord, have mercy. So then, let's go back to the presentation, right? This is the presentation. Anyway, another thing I talked about last December was there needs to be this revisioning process. You can see it's a big thing on the horizon. I didn't get to that point in December, but we are at that point now that I've been here for a year. There's lots of people asking, so what is the vision? What's the 1, 5, 10-year vision? What are we living into? I have a lot of thoughts about that. I'm not going to share all them right now. But just to let you know that is a big part of the project coming up. So we're not only going to be thinking about worship, we're not only going to be thinking about ministry teams, stepping deeper into these discipleship formation things, but another sort of big block there is a revisioning process. And some of the people that will be most involved in that are staff and consistory, but we will be getting other people involved. One of the best parts about being this media marketing team that we gathered, that includes Liz Ledke and Dan Reynolds and Drew Palmer and Mike Novak and Spencer Rates and Stephanie and myself, is that there's been a whole group of people, the first 5 people I mentioned, that aren't, Dan's on consistory, but aren't typically involved in some of the leadership conversations, but have important things to say about who we are as a church and what it means to project ourselves as a church and what are some of the greatest assets we have as a church. And that's been a really fun conversation. And we're looking to get more people involved than just the staff and the consistory, even though those will be the key players in what it means for us to revision and have a new set of mission, visions, and values and the ways in which we're going to actually live into those things. So that's a big thing that's not just on the horizon now. The horizon has come to us. And so that's something that needs to happen in 2021 in addition to those other things that I was mentioning. Meanwhile, as we think big picture about all that stuff, I just want to remind people there's continuing ministry happening. And one of the ways you can stay in touch about that community, continuing ministry, is to continue to pay attention to your email. I know email inboxes have become flooded, especially for parents with all sorts of stuff related to your children. But we're going to reflood your mailboxes. We took a break in the summertime. We had been doing a ton in the spring. We're going to send out a few more emails here in the fall. Not every day, but every Wednesday you're going to see an email that has to do with outreach ministry that we're involved in, with updates about various things. Everything from Safe Harbor to the single mom ministry that we support. And we've had a single mom living in our Anderson Road house for a long time. And that partnership, the latest partnership with that mom, Jessica, has come to an end. And so now there's going to be a new single mom moving in there that's in conjunction with single mom ministry. There's going to be updates about our participation in TC Cares, updates from other things related to the missions team. So pay attention to those and get involved where you want to get involved, and know that continuing ministry is taking place. And just be on the lookout for further communication about all these things as we step into the future. So that's all I've got. What would be really helpful at this point is to think about whatever questions you have, and maybe come to the town hall on Sunday, or come to Jacob's Farm with those questions on Sunday. I'm glad to talk to you. And in the meantime, if any of this has compelled you to pray prayers of thanksgiving or prayers of intercession, I'd invite you to pray even now as you turn this off. That's all.